This is Joe Gallo, and I just want to do a couple of literally quick administrative points. First off, you just heard this is being recorded, so it'll be available then for playback for many others. The required disclaimer is that anything that we present, you hear or see today is not intended as a recommendation or medical advice. And in fact, we encourage you that if you find something of interest, that you do take it to your own medical team. When we get going here, we've asked everybody to try to put their location in the box so we get some idea who you are. It would be preferable, but not required, that maybe when the sessions are going on, the ones you're not participating in, that you might also want to turn your camera off. Otherwise, you can be distracted by somebody who's eating their lunch. The last part is, if you have any questions that you would like to be recognized for, please put them in the chat, okay? And then each of the panel leaders will then call upon you. You can either have your question answered strictly from the chat, or you can be called upon to discuss it openly. We need to make sure that since we have so much to cover today, especially, that you minimize the amount of personal background that we go forward with. And can't guarantee that we'll get everybody's question answered, but if you have it in the chat and you would like to get a response from somebody, just please make a note in the chat as well. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Mark Lichty.
So let me welcome you all to this. I'm chairman of Active Surveillance Patients International, and we're the first organization that is dedicated solely to helping men with low risk and intermediate risk prostate cancer to navigate active surveillance. And I wanted to thank you all on behalf of the dozen sponsoring organizations. And all of those attending the event. This is going to be the largest gathering of patient advocates, researchers, clinicians since Dr. Laurence Klotz named the active surveillance approach nearly 30 years ago. And we find ourselves at a time of an explosion of learning and patient empowerment through efforts like this that we'll witness here today. We're here to discuss the compelling questions around the future of active surveillance. More important, the studies leading to this event are crafted to hear your voices, the voices of the patients. And these studies were done, these studies, more than any done to date, reflect a giant step towards embracing the knowledge that men like you have to offer. There are too many people to thank here, but allow me to thank a few. Howard, you saw the significance of these studies and the efforts to assess the future of active surveillance and planted the seed to organize this event. And many of you on the call will realize that a diagnosis of prostate cancer offers unexpected blessings to forge new friendships, as has occurred with Howard and I and many others on this call. And Howard, you've touched the lives of many men trying to navigate active surveillance journey. Howard's a co-founder of Active Surveillance Patients International and very involved with Rick Davis in the ANCan effort, as is Joe Gallo, who's on this call as well. And we thank Dr. Minaj Siddiqui, a visionary surgeon on the faculty of the University of Maryland, and Dr. Carolyn Moore from the University of the College of London, whose Twitter handle, by the way, is Mrs. Prostate. And she pioneered the use of the MRI prior to biopsies. There are too many to thank here, but allow me to, well, I'm going to welcome you back, Howard, along with your prostate as well. So you're on.
5 years ago, the founders of Active Surveillance Patients International, and that includes Mark Lichty, Throne, Thorvaldsen, Gene Slater, Slattery, I mean, and I started ASPI. And we tried to hold a meeting on the future of AS, active surveillance, in Iceland. Frankly, I always wanted to go to Iceland, thought that was a good excuse. And Mike Scott, the founder of Prostate Cancer International, tried to run a parallel program with researchers, all in Iceland. But big plans, nothing happened. Move ahead 5 years. Last winter, several of us joined 2 projects researching the future of active surveillance. One was inspired by Mike and led by Dr. Minhaj Siddiqui of the University of Maryland and funded by PCORI. The other was inspired by Movember, the Australian men's health dynamo, and led by Dr. Carolyn Moore of the University College London. So a dream of 5 years ago finally has come to fruition in this webinar. We have many of the top researchers who developed AS who are supposed to be here, including Dr. Klotz, who named it. And we have many up and coming researchers and top patient advocates. We had about 400 registrants for this meeting coming from 20 countries. US, Canada, UK, Belgium, and some surprising places like Pakistan, Bulgaria, Hong Kong, and Singapore. I was going to turn the program over to Dr. Siddiqui and Moore and Tony, but I've already mentioned Dr. Siddiqui and Dr. Moore, and Tony Crispino, who's another moderator, is one of the top advocates for active surveillance, even though he himself was treated for more advanced disease. He's sort of the patient's patient. He represents us in the halls of science and power for urology. He's the patient rep, often to the American Urological Association and to many of the research groups. And I'm going to pass this over to Minhaj.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just share the screen. So it's truly an honor to be here speaking with you all today. And it's just so exciting to see this incredible convergence of energy and people and minds. And I think we're all witnessing I think an exciting chapter in the space of prostate cancer active surveillance, and I hope that this event, amongst the many things going on right now, will be something we can kind of look back at as kind of the catalyst, for some really exciting advancements in this space, and something that really ends up helping out a lot of people going forward. Just because I'm the first one sharing the screen, I want to just make sure everyone was oriented to the proposed structure for the day. This will just give you an idea of expectations. We hope to run from currently 11 Eastern time. Everyone's from different areas, but essentially from now to 2 hours from now is the proposal. We've already heard from Mark and Howard. I will be running through a little bit of background on a complementary initiative called the PCRI initiative, and Dr. Moore will run through the Movember initiative. And then we really want to just transition into the panels. The panels is going to be the meat of the day. There will be 3 panels centered around 3 topics: towards a more dynamic risk-adjusted active surveillance approach, towards integration of MRI and biomarkers in the use of active surveillance, and a panel focused on the patient research disconnect, bringing together perspectives on what's needed for active surveillance. These panels are meant to be and desired to be interactive with you all, and so these will be the opportunities. Each of these will be about half an hour, and this will be the opportunity for your voices to be heard, and for for us to share ideas. And then concluding remarks will be with Mike Scott. So On December 13th and 16th, we held a 2-day symposium called Developing Provocative Questions, the Prostate Cancer Active Surveillance Research Initiative, which I'll be referencing as PCASRI. This was a joint effort of numerous organizations, including ANCan, ASPI, PCai, PCRI, Zero Prostate Cancer, Focal Therapy Society, through University of Maryland, where I am, and the Patients Program over here. And many of these organizations are co-sponsoring today. And the goal of the initiative was to organize a diverse and highly interested group of people, including patients, caregivers, support networks, providers, researchers, physicians, to identify and address what the needs are in the space of decisions that men diagnosed with low-risk prostate cancer are making for the management of their disease, with an obvious intent that improving the use of active surveillance in this population. This conference was widely attended by a whole range and diverse group of people, patients, clinicians, researchers, advocates, family, and friends. And we came together and collectively talked about this in a very structured way. And we generated, through a structured process of breakout rooms and kind of going back and forth, 8 priority questions that we as a group felt, if answered, would advance the current practice of active surveillance. And so today I'm just going to really quickly run through what those 8 priority questions came out of that initiative. And what's really unique about this is, there's plenty of research that gets done. All too often, the research is from questions that are derived by academics, often engage with patients, but not necessarily always engage with patients, and may not always reflect actually what the people who are actually living with the disease desire most. And so it was our hope that this kind of process and this event really push forward the patient engaged aspect of why we're doing this research in the first place, and develop questions that would be most interesting. So the top 8 questions that came out of the conference: number 8, in men with intermediate risk prostate cancer, is high intensity interval training comparable to a handout of general exercise recommendations for the outcome of grade progression? And you'll notice these are designed as research questions. So and I'm not going to get too much into depth in this, but it may come across as a little pedantic, but it helps focus like the fact of making these actionable questions. Number 7, the question that came out was the use of consultation to improve active surveillance. And so is consultation through multidisciplinary clinics equivalent to specialist visits augmented by second opinions with health educators? Number 6, and then with prostate cancer appropriate for active surveillance, does the addition of genomic testing, MRI with fusion biopsy, or both genomic testing and fusion biopsy lead to improvements in both monitoring the tumor for progression as well as patient experience such as anxiety, safety, and adherence to active surveillance? Number 5, in men going active surveillance, can we use micro ultrasound, and is this equivalent to MRI monitoring for detecting progression and adverse pathology of prostate cancer? Number 4, and one subset of questions was really to figure out how we can help address disparities. And so along that line, in Black men diagnosed prostate cancer, is supplemented education with in-person support groups equivalent to telemedicine support groups for the outcome of choosing active surveillance and staying on active surveillance? Number 3, in men with prostate cancer, can we do a lower follow-up intensity for active surveillance? And is that equivalent to the standard follow-up intensity? So instead of doing every 3-month PSA, can we do every 6 month or every year? Can we do yearly, every 2-year biopsies, every 3-year biopsies, things like that? 2, in men with favorable intermediate risk prostate cancer, can we do focal therapy of the visible tumor and then continue active surveillance? And is that comparable to performing active surveillance alone? And the number 1 question that actually came up was in men with prostate cancer and active surveillance is an MRI-based surveillance plan equivalent to the current standard practice plan, which also uses frequent biopsies for outcome of cancer progression. And so I went through these questions to help kind of get everyone thinking. You know, what we were really proud of in this whole process was that we were able, through substantial collaboration with patients and advocacy groups, to come up with meaningful directions to guide the future academic research endeavors in this space. And we're continuing analysis and hoping to really disseminate this information through peer-reviewed publications so that the academic community can become aware of these questions and hopefully start taking up these questions to study. We're building groups of collaborators to represent diverse practices. And so initiatives like today are actually part of the goal. And if you're interested in contributing to this type of work, this is an email address you can reach out to. Thank you. Next, I will actually hand it off to Dr. Carolyn Moore to discuss her work with the Movember initiative.
So I'm Carolyn Moore. I'm a urologist in London University College, and I've been working with Movember on a particular active surveillance project that I'm going to share with you now. So hopefully you can see this in full screen. So if somebody wants to let me know if you can't. So many of you will be familiar with Movember. It's the largest global men's health charity, and it looks in particular at prostate and testicular cancer, mental health and suicide prevention. And it has a unique way of working in that it's really keen to bring together people, both patients and researchers across the globe, to look at key questions in each of the areas that they address. So back in 2018, 2019, and this was then published in 2020, they did a landscape analysis of prostate cancer to look at the unmet research needs. Now, this analysis went from screening through to diagnosis of late-stage disease and treatment of late-stage disease. But 2 out of the top 3 priority areas in this analysis were related to active surveillance. So they then decided that they would do a dedicated process to look more deeply into the research needs in active surveillance and how they could address these. So myself and a team from UCL and Scotland were commissioned to work on this, taking things in 3 stages. So first, to look at the current evidence in surveillance, then to gather a diverse set of voices, both patients and healthcare professionals, and to bring us together in a consensus process to really look at the next set of research priorities. Now, Minaj and I were very much aware of each other's processes as we were going through this, and we participated in each other's processes. It was really interesting to see how the different methodology came up with many similarities and a few differences. So our first point of call was a review of the literature, and I will just give you a small flavour of that in a moment. Then we set up 2 independent panels, one for men with lived experience of prostate cancer and the second for healthcare professionals. We generated a set of statements, and I think there were over 300 statements altogether between the 2 panels, about the different stages of the active surveillance prostate cancer journey. And from this, we identified the highest priorities in research for active surveillance. So in terms of the evidence, just a mention of the variation that there is between different countries, 1 in the spectrum of risk that men are diagnosed with, and 2 in what happens to those men. And some countries have much better publication of their prostate cancer statistics than others. So in Australia and New Zealand, they have a joint registry, and over half of men who are diagnosed have Gleason grade 1 or 2. And they break it down also into the NCCN risk groups and by age group. And you can see that the low risk group just here is nearly 1/3 of men under 60, 1/4 of men 60 to 64, and a little less as you go along. So these are men who would very often be suitable for active surveillance and may or may not be offered it, may or may not accept it. So 81% of men under 60 in Australia and New Zealand are diagnosed with low or intermediate risk disease. Now, in the UK, we have, certainly in NHS England, we have a very MRI-led diagnostic process. And for many men with a negative MRI and a normal PSA density, the amount of PSA for the size of the prostate, they won't get a biopsy. And that means we diagnose fewer men with low-risk disease. So in England, only 20% of men have Gleason 6 disease, and only 6% of men altogether have low-risk disease. When we look at what happens to those men, the majority of men with low-risk disease will be on active surveillance, and only 5% of men with low-risk localized disease had radical treatment back in 17-18, which was the latest data period that we've got. So there we are with the evidence. We looked also when we were looking for our lived experience expert panel, and we have many of the panelists here today. Some were new to surveillance, some had been on surveillance for a long time, some had been on surveillance and carried on and had treatment, and many were representing much wider bodies than just themselves in terms of the different prostate cancer and active surveillance initiatives across the world. Again, when we looked for the healthcare professional expert panel, we were keen to get people across the different countries looking at different aspects of active surveillance. So you can see here we had pathology, radiology, nursing, behavioral scientists, radiation oncologists, urologists, all sorts of different people across the globe to really get a really wide view on what we should be doing next in surveillance. As I mentioned before, we discussed a number of consensus statements. There were over 300 altogether. It was 12 hours of Zoom meetings, which was a lot for everybody who participated. And then the final part was that we ranked the research priorities that we developed. So you can see here the healthcare professional ranked research priorities looked at personalized active surveillance and improving tests as the highest ranked priorities. And these were the two that also came out top in the lived experience panel. So personalizing active surveillance and improving the tests that we use on surveillance. This then goes through an internal process at Movember, and they're doing that at present. And then they'll be putting out a research call for people to develop ideas in those two areas, and that should be coming out in the next 3 or 4 months. We'll be publishing the funding priorities work and the evidence review, and we'll be looking for collaborators and people to join the work as it develops further. So I'd like to thank you all for listening and to hand back to Dr. Siddiqui to start the first panel.
Wonderful. All right. Well, so this kicks off the hopefully interactive portion of the conference. It's my pleasure to introduce the first panel. This panel is focused on what can be done to push the field towards a more dynamic, risk-adjusted active surveillance approach. You know, historically, active surveillance has kind of been a catch-up, but I think we all recognize that there are patients who are very, very safe for active surveillance, and there are probably patients who are a little more borderline. And it may well make sense to adjust how patients are monitored in situations where really they're quite safe to be surveyed, and maybe we can spread things out, or maybe we can use different technologies in different ways, as opposed to situations which are, you know, the more borderline situations. And so that is the general space that we want to talk about. You know, in terms of some of like the themes that came up from these two initiatives, the PCai and Movember initiative, themes such as integration of follow-up intensity, focal therapy, even MRI and genomics, although I would like to steer us away from talking too much about MRI and biomarkers in this session, since we have a whole second session dedicated towards that. The panelists for this session are Dr. Chris Bangma. Dr. Bangma is a professor of urology at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam. He's a leader in the introduction of active surveillance in Europe. He's been a coordinator of some very influential, very large studies, namely the PRIAS, P-R-I-A-S, and the GAP3 studies. And we're very thankful that he has joined us today. Dr. Ola Bratt is a professor and consultant urologic surgeon at the Prostate Cancer Center in Gothenburg, Sweden, and the chairman of the National Prostate Cancer Guidelines Group in Sweden. Also has just overseen and pushed forward some incredible work in this space. Dr. David Crawford is a professor of urology at the University of California, San Diego. He is also the editor-in-chief of Graham Rounds in Urology. Dr. Crawford has had an incredible professional history with numerous contributions in the world of prostate cancer, including prostate cancer active surveillance. Mark Lichty, who we heard from in the beginning, in the opening, is the chairman of the Active Patients International and does immense work in the space of patient advocacy. And Ira Caggett is a facilitator in the newly diagnosed support group and board member of the Prostate Forum of Orange County. And similarly, just does an incredible amount of work with the space of patient advocacy. So really look forward to hearing your thoughts. I want to open it up with a seed question. And then, please type in your questions. We will try to monitor your questions. And what we will do is we will integrate your questions as they kind of integrate with the theme and the topic we're discussing. And we may even ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So we'll call out your name. And so ask your question, and then that'll be the prompt for us to call you out to ask your question. And we'll try to keep it organized that way. But as an opening question, just to get the conversation started, before we start diving into how to do risk-adjusted dynamic active surveillance approaches, let's just start off with the question, is there a role for risk-adjusted follow-up in prostate cancer, such that some patients have closer follow-up and others do not? And what are your thoughts along those lines, and how we should be focused on developing that space? Why don't we have, I'm not sure I've seen everybody here yet, but I did see Dr. Crawford. So maybe Dr. Crawford, it would be good to have you start.
Great. Thanks for that nice introduction before Dr. Siddiqui. I would say absolutely. Today, medicine is about precision medicine. One size doesn't fit all. There are various categories of active surveillance and ways that they're evaluated and diagnosed. In general, I don't want to be the rotten apple in this whole group, but my goal is to eliminate active surveillance. We don't want to find patients for active surveillance. We want to find people that need to be treated. And it's sort of the problem with medicine right now. We have diabetes, heart disease, everything else like that. I'm actually at the Androgen Society meeting right now in Orlando and talking about health and exercise and things like that. And I think we need to do better at prevention and not fixing things with Band-Aids. Active surveillance, we're going to get patients no matter what, but we ought to reduce it and find people that need to be treated. Nevertheless, when we have people, I think there are men that have had just a single biopsy in Gleason 6, for instance, a grade group 1 or maybe a 2, and then may or may not have had an MRI. Well, that's a different person than someone that's had multiple biopsies, had maybe mapping biopsies, and had positive MRI, and maybe even a PET scan. I use this point detection right now about, is this a 3 or 4 point detection? Is this something that we detected by biopsy? Did we confirm it? That was where it was with MRI. Now we have PET scans that play a role. and maybe even other different imaging. So absolutely, yes, I think we got to do that. I think we have to stratify people by germline and polygenic risk scores. And it's getting pretty interesting, all the things that you can look at, but definitely one size does not fit all.
Do any of the panel members have thoughts feeding off of what? And you know what? I've learned this through some of the other kind of patient engaged forums I've done. I'll transition, not out of lack of respect to everyone, but I'll transition to just calling everyone with their first name, including the physicians. It actually helps encourage just discourse, if you will. And so we'll just start calling everybody by their first names. But so Chris, Ola, Mark, or Ira, and any thoughts from y'all?
If I could add, I agreed with everything that Dr. Crawford said. One of the things that they're talking about even now is the possibility of eliminating a Gleason 6, which is its own form of stratification. And we had seen in the past an epidemic of over-treatment of prostate cancer. And now we are kind of emerging through the other side of an epidemic of over-biopsying prostate cancer. And that's welcome progress. And one of the things that Active Surveillance Patients International feels strongly about is the need to reduce anxiety. Anxiety causes cortisol. Cortisol causes all kinds of other issues that are not helpful with prostate cancer. So through the process of risk stratification, we can help men to navigate active surveillance in a more humane way, if you will. And so the emphasis, hopefully through risk stratification, will be to detect men that are progressing to a Gleason 8. And we, by the way, our board has two Active Surveillance Patients International has 2 men on the board. One of them is on this call. Both Throne and Joe Gallo are on this call. Both of those men progressed through a Gleason 8. So if we can get more skilled at stratification, maybe we'll catch those kinds of cancers a little bit earlier. So absolutely. And we have a long way to go in the skill of risk stratification. So thank you.
Wonderful. I see Laurence Klotz has his hand up. You're muted, or your mic is not catching.
Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
And hello, everybody. I'm on the next panel, but I just thought I'd jump in. So I certainly agree with my old friend Dave Crawford about the importance of risk stratification, but he is somewhat guilty of wishful thinking, because whether the terminology changes, which could happen, and whether we move to a different approach to doing biopsy, it's very clear we're still going to be finding what today we call grade group 1 prostate cancer. So for example, if you look at the impact of doing targeted only biopsies, the rate of finding grade group 1 cancer drops. It does drop by 50%, but it drops from about 25% to 10 to 15% of cases. So that's still a considerable number. And I agree with the goal of a more targeted approach to biopsy is to reduce the number of patients found to have clinically insignificant cancer. But it is safe to say, I believe, no matter how we refine our biopsy strategy, and no matter what we call it, we are still going to be finding these cases who have this low-grade abnormality, whether you call it grade group 1 cancer, or whether you call it a indolent neoplasm of low malignant potential, whatever the name, we will be finding it, and the implications and the management will be the same as we're trying to work out now.
So Laurie, it's Dave Crawford. Thanks. No, I did not say that we're going to eliminate active surveillance. And it's still going to be around, and I agree with everything you said, but we can reduce the incidence significantly by focusing on and we have ways to do it right now. And this is
That
where
I
we
agree
got
with.
into a lot of trouble with overdiagnosis and overtreatment, things like that. So it's something that we have, but I think we can significantly reduce the amount of men that are in that category. As far as grade group 1 or Gleason 6 cancers, as you know, we had a meeting probably 8 or 10 years ago in Chicago about reclassification of prostate cancer, and there was a discussion about eliminating Gleason 6 in grade group, and they decided to put it in grade group 1. There's a variation in Gleason 6s that occur. I think everybody knows that. Maybe less than 10% of them are bad. But again, the big thing is when you do biopsies of the prostate, MRIs, everything else like that, and we've shown this with over 1,000 mapping biopsies, about 30% of the time when you think you got it right that way, you miss something significant. So it's never going to be perfect.
I think this is actually a good opportunity. I see both Ira and Ola's hands up, but I actually want to, in the spirit of really trying to integrate the audience questions, I think David Keller's question fits in well with our discussion right now. So I'd like for him to ask his question first. And then I do want to hear from both Ola and Ira. So David.
Okay. You want me to ask my question?
I think so. I think it fits actually with what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, my question is, have we developed or are we in the process of developing a decision-making / activity deciding grid for various stages of the disease, particularly 3+3, high volume and low volume? What do you do and when? And then of course, 3+4, what are the various decision-making steps, activity steps, and what are all the factors within them, the DRE, the MRIs, the biopsies, the genomic markers, the deciphers, the oncotypes, et cetera? What role do they play? When should they be brought in? And how should they be factored into the patients and the clinicians' feeling about where the patient is at in terms of prostate health? That's my question.
Ola, do you want to take on some combination of this and what we've been talking about?
I can do what I can. It's a very good question, and clearly there is an interaction between the tumor and the man. So there will never be an algorithm or a clear grid for the cancer only. It always has to include the man, his preferences, his other conditions, his age. But I think for most groups of men, it's possible to define tumors for which we definitely should recommend active surveillance, and a group of cancers that we should definitely recommend treatment of. And in the middle, there is clearly, and there will always be, cancers that may or may not be treated, depending on several factors that won't fit into a square grid, and also, of course, men's preferences. So I think what we need to do is to group these three groups and make them clear. And those groups will, of course, be different for the 55-year-old healthy man and a 75-year-old man with diabetes and some heart condition.
Thank you. Ira?
David, in response to your question about, biomarkers and the treatments of them, like in my case, I've been in active surveillance since 2009. And, I had like a grade group 6, and I'm just going along and getting my biopsies, everything's fine. And then I had a second opinion about 2013, where I had a Gleason 4. So at that point, I sought out a genomic test, which fortunately for me showed it was favorable. and I've still been going on with it. So it was a tie break. It was a tiebreaker. So I guess each person is individual. So if you have a low grade cancer, you really don't need to have some of these biomarkers, but it's a deal breaker for other ones. And then I like to add something to the first point. With monitoring different men, there's new technologies coming out, especially the PSMA, and this will enable men to make better decisions and maybe have less biopsies, because it's going to show things that just are not available. Another part of our group discussion is about focal therapy. So there's been some preliminary studies between combining MRI and PSMAs, which shows they could find a lot more significant cancers that could be treated with focal.
Thank you. You know what strikes me about the comments you both made? So I mean, I think that we often immediately focus on the disease, and we start characterizing aspects of the disease to figure out how to stratify people. But I think, Ola, you made this comment, you also have to focus on the individual, and there are factors that would change how you treat the same disease based on different individuals. I actually see 3 questions that touch base on the same topic. So I'm going to call out on, let's see here, Jeffrey McLennan, and then Richard May, excuse me, and lastly, Brian Jarvis, because I think all 3 of you are touching base on this kind of aspect of the patient. And I don't hear this as much as I hear about focusing on the disease. And so I think that this is worth maybe probing a little further. Maybe, so why don't you ask your question, Jeffrey, first?
Thank you very much from Northern California here. Yeah, I find that my experience had to do with a lot of anxiety that was perhaps unnecessary, and it would have been gratefully helpful to have had a mental health professional in or around the clinic that I was working with, going to at the time. I just think it saves a lot of anxiety, and it creates a more positive feel in the family for a man who comes home with a prostate cancer diagnosis.
Thank you. And then Richard?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Throughout my career as a hospital administrator, I have been trying to integrate behavioral health services with primary care, particularly embedding primary care mental health specialists on-site in primary care and specialist offices. And I wrote an article for Howard Walensky's newsletter, Active Surveiller, about how important it would be to have patients that are initially visiting their urologist and other specialists to have a brief anxiety and depression screening using a tablet, which is used here in my state of Ohio in America, to take the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7 depression and anxiety screening tools. That allows the specialist to get a baseline on the emotional well-being when they start discussing cancer and treatments, and can possibly intervene earlier by making recommendations for the patient to see counseling. Thank you.
That's great. And Brian?
Yes, my name is Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I was diagnosed in 2012 with a very low-grade Gleason 6 PSA of 4. And for me, there was no anxiety at all. I'm a retired computer scientist. And with me, I kicked in with the analysis and data mining and figuring out about it. I was on active surveillance for 8 years, but I've seen other men I've talked to with my same numbers who just wanted the damn thing cut out. And so how do you risk stratify when you have individuals with exactly the same numbers, but a different mindset on how they want to deal with it and the outcome, the side effects and all that?
And this is a great topic. I love that we're kind of honing in on this and hearing different people's perspective. Jim, it seems like you're actually kind of Jim Sims. Do you mind sharing as well? Your question seems to also be along this line.
Yeah, absolutely. I was diagnosed in 2006. Initially, it was a Gleason 7, got a second opinion from Jonathan Epstein, read 5 books. And I remember my wife at the time saying, "What do you mean you're going to do nothing?" And that was 2006. My urologist now calls me an active surveillance pioneer. But to me, having been an emergency medical technician, I think I had a certain outlook towards the cancer. And the one thing that I tell men is when my urologist first told me the results of the biopsy, he said, "You have a little bit of cancer." I focused on the little bit, not on the word cancer. I've encountered men that have been on active surveillance 2, 3, or 4 years. All of a sudden they have radiation or they have surgery. And I say to them, "What's happened? Has your cancer worsened?" No, I couldn't wake up every day knowing I have cancer in my body. And I think whether we call it something other than cancer, if men think they have cancer, it's going to be like the big C. It's a fear that's going to be part of their psyche, and some of them are not going to be able to wake up. I think every urologist, every oncologist should have some sort of mental health resources that they offer to men so that they can deal with that very burdening news, "You've got cancer."
That's great insight. Thank you. So I think why don't I come back to the panel, and we haven't actually heard Chris Bangma, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are. Well, wonderful. So I personally feel like this is not discussed enough, and it's striking how many people just kind of came up and talked or speaking when we're talking about doing risk-adjusted dynamic active surveillance approach. The conversation's gotten into this space of adjusting to the patient's tolerance and anxiety levels, it seems. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I have to say, of course, I should be very modest about doing generalized or explanations about how people act. The modesty is partly because I'm part of the team that is, in fact, causing all of this misery about active surveillance. Having started in 1995, the European randomized screening study, when Louis Denis and Fritz Schroeder intended, with best regards, to heal patients from their, let's say, aggressive tumors. Well, it soon turned out that we were finding far too many non-aggressive tumors. And from that moment onwards, we felt, of course, how should we not only monitor the tumor, but just like Ola said, how do we have to monitor the people? And we have not come up yet with a generalized system how to approach those cancer patients because they are all taking a different coping strategy. The one is very active in finding let's say, supportive food or sports activities, while the other one is looking for the blackest spot in the house in order to hide itself from its surrounding, being afraid that his cancer will take over. So I think that you hit the spot very well for the last 3 speakers, or telling about their experiences, that half of the job is not only with the tumor, which we by all kinds of old and new risk factors can put into an algorithm which might, based on data and another data, the risk of progression or stabilization of the tumor, the long end, etc. but that we also have to focus far more on the psychological facts, how to approach all of these men. And that, as Ola said, takes an individual approach and a personalized approach, and takes a lot of people to support. Well, having said so, your question is, can we, from the tumor side, calculate the risks? And of course, with 30 years of data behind us from screening studies, we know just a simple little bit about tumors, most expressed in Gleason and tumor and prostate sizes and PSA. But the more modern equipment gives us MRI and gives us genetic markers or even serum markers. They all seem to add just in a variable bit of risk towards what we were already able to say about the progression risk of the tumors that we find. So based on those data, we are learning all the time, but we cannot give too much emphasis on the fact that still an intensive follow-up is based on not escaping that risk of progression. So yes, I believe, just like David said, that we can alter and modify our approaches for risk-based monitoring, but we have to be very careful about it, because the long-term follow-up, just like Laurence Klotz added with his Toronto data, we simply don't have it for all this new technology. So we're looking at it, but we still have to be very careful.
These are great points. Thank you. I'm going to give myself a 5-minute warning here, because just to keep us on, I feel like we're just picking up a ton of momentum, and we could probably keep talking like this for an hour. I think we can close out this panel with 2 more comments. One, I see Tim Wilt, and one, Anthony Henry, excuse me. He said that I would like to add that mental health and other consultative services are important in the primary care setting, where the large amount of men with prostate cancer first get screened, and then follow up for the discussions that include all their healthcare concerns, including prostate cancer. And then Anthony Henry.
Yes, so I pointed out that offering psychological counseling on an ongoing basis is very important. We can't assume that because someone's scans or their MRIs or their PSAs are stable that they're fine on there. That's very important. And another point was also being open and being willing to engage and discuss your situation with people who are similarly impacted. In my case, for example, it was only because I opened up and spoke to others that I was aware of the whole issue of decision regret on there. And so it kind of made me step back a little bit and take a look at, what I was being recommended to do, and kind of help to inform my decision that way. Thank you.
Actually, I'll go back and add one more person. Rick Davis, you actually have a very thoughtful comment, and I think will help maybe transition us. So
yeah, I just stepped away for a second.
Oh no,
you'll have to repeat your question.
I was just saying, I liked your comment, because actually your comment kind of marries the space of the biology disease characterization with the mental health aspect we're talking about. So I feel like it's a nice kind of way to close out this session.
The comment about should we about renaming cancer, that comment?
Yeah.
Well, I really have to defer that one to Howard. I can't steal Howard's thunder. Howard, are you there? I want you have to make this comment, man. This is your topic.
Well, I was trying not to plug any crusades, but I had a paper in the the Journal of Clinical Oncology this week with Dr. Egner and Dr. Cooperberg, talking about what a diagnosis of Gleason 6 means psychologically because of the cancer connection. And some of the other speakers have talked about the what we call anxious surveillance, how anxiety and depression can emerge from the diagnosis. I have to give credit to Chris Banga, because his group is looking at ways to keep patients on active surveillance and not have them scared off because of the anxiety issue. We need more research on that. And the second point, it has to do with financial toxicity. And actually, I've been running a survey on this myself. And a small percentage of us have actually experienced financial implications. My insurance company wanted to cancel my term policy for $500,000 because of this diagnosis. And so my agent went searching and found 7 other companies to apply to, and they all rejected me because of Gleason 6. Dr. Egner went to bat for me, and in the end, I was, for the same premium, I was offered $400,000 less coverage. So, but I'm not here to campaign for that. But I think I thought that Rick was being called on to plug support groups, and Bill Manning had made a point about that. Maybe Bill can get in a minute, but I'm trying to be more in the background. But thanks, Rick.
Can I just say one quick thing here, which is that it would be very interesting if we could survey active surveillance patients and ask them, would they be more willing to remain on active surveillance if their diagnosis was not named cancer? There's a challenge to Dr. Minhaj and others, and let's really see how much of the concern really is around the anxiety.
Yeah, I don't know, Minhaj, if we can take up much more time, but I see some interesting comments here.
Yeah, might I suggest, I think between the second and third sessions, if your question didn't get addressed, some of these questions seem like they actually will overlap with the second and third panel. So why don't we transition and please hold on to your question and even re-ask it when the topic seems appropriate, and hopefully we will be able to actually breach into these topics as we continue with the day. But I mean, this is too much engagement is exactly the problem we were hoping to have, and so let's just keep up with this momentum. This is great. And so I would like to transition now to Dr. Carolyn Moore, and thank you.
Great, thank you. And I will introduce the panel initially, and then I will do my best to keep an eye on the questions as they're coming up thick and fast. So it's great to see Dr. Laurence Klotz, who's with us from Toronto. We've already seen him and he's spoken, and I think it would be fair, Laurie, to say that you'd be considered the grandfather of active surveillance. So it's great to have you here. We also have Dr. Antonio Westphalen from University of Washington, who is Professor of Radiology, Chief of Abdominal Imaging there. Dr. Carissa Chu is joining us on behalf of Peter Carroll, and she is the SUO Fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering currently. And then in terms of patients, Philip Seagal, co-founder of Prostate Cancer Support Canada, and Eric Breers, who has a number of roles in surveillance and prostate cancer, but in particular is Vice Chairman of EUROPA UOMO. So the questions set for our panel are really about how we integrate MRI and biomarkers into active surveillance. And I think it's fair to say that there is huge variation on this across the world. So In my own practice at UCH in London, we use MRI prior to confirming a diagnosis, and the majority of men get an MRI before a biopsy unless they've come from another sort of jurisdiction. And then we use MRI as the principal surveillance tool along with PSA. So we don't tend to do standard routine biopsies. We do them if the MRI suggests a change or if the PSA changes and we don't see that. So it'd be great to have some other views from the panel, particularly on biomarkers as well, and then also questions from the floor. So perhaps Dr. Westphalen, maybe I could call on you to comment on this one.
Well, thanks for having me here first. It's now a fantastic group of people. I agree, there's a lot of variation, and now I see what you guys do there, and we look at what we do here, and even in the US, there's a lot of variation. We have groups that are not using MR as much. We have groups that are using MR following the initial biopsy, maybe for a confirmatory guided biopsy. And there's room for change. There's a lot of room for change. I see Carissa just turned her camera on there too. Hey, long time no see. And I think a lot of that may be modified what was mentioned before, which is individualized care. Now, some men may definitely need it early. Some men may postpone a little bit, and we're not there yet, though.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Carissa, it would be great to get your perspective on this.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carissa Chu. I'm a fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Thanks for including me on this panel. So I'm a little bit in transit here. So I can speak a little bit about, UCSF's experience, the University of California San Francisco's experience with the use of MRI on active surveillance, and namely focusing on, the number of clinically significant lesions that can potentially be missed by using an MRI protocol. Are you having some trouble hearing me?
It is a little bit hard to hear you.
Okay, maybe you can circle back to me, Dr. Moore. I'm going to troubleshoot my AV on this side.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Laurie, I don't know if you're in a position where you can jump in. I can see that you're in.
Yes.
It's great.
So yeah, I mean, the short answer to the question is yes, it is possible. In fact, it's here now. So I really have 3 points to make on this topic. The first is I think it's better to refer to imaging rather than MRI because there's other technologies, and in particular, the one that I've embraced is high resolution micro ultrasound. There's now about somewhere around 8 to 10 papers in the literature that compare the sensitivity of micro ultrasound to MRI and show it really looks comparable in terms of its ability to detect the presence of clinically significant prostate cancer. And it's a lot less expensive. It doesn't require the contrast. It's done by urologists, which makes it appealing to our specialty. And so I use it kind of complementary to MRI. It is a different technology. It doesn't lend itself to kind of close scrutiny after the fact. It's kind of a real-time imaging, but it has really worked for me and for a number of my colleagues around the world to kind of reduce the reliance on MRI, because access to MRI is a problem in a lot of places. The second point is that this is all about risk stratification. So for example, if you have a patient with say a 20% chance based on one of many nomograms of having clinically significant cancer that was missed, and their MRI or their ultrasound or their micro ultrasound is negative, then that risk drops quite precipitously. The negative predictive value of these tests is typically around 85%. So just using simple arithmetic, it means their risk of having a missed cancer drops from say 20% to around 3%, which is a whole different ball game in terms of how aggressively you would try and find that. And then, but the third point is that the MRI, and this has been alluded to, it's not a perfect handmaiden. It's been a tremendously powerful tool for us to give us a target to aim for and to find these cancers that previously had been missed. And my own view is that by incorporating MRI, we're going to drop that, we're going to address that troubling 1 to 3% 15-year mortality rate and get it down even lower. But it's not perfect. So it does miss significant number of usually smaller grade group 2 or 3 cancers. So we haven't abandoned biopsy at all, but we do it a lot less frequently than we used to. So typically, if I have a patient with a stable MRI, I do the biopsy about every 5 years, whereas before it was kind of every 2 to 3 years. And every 5 years is much more appealing to patients.
Thanks, Laurie. And we have a couple of questions on this on the chat. So it would be good. Tony, you've got a question there. I don't know if you want to unmute and.
Yeah, sure. I can speak directly to having met Laurie many years ago over at PCRI in Los Angeles, and he's very familiar with Dubon and the colored biopsy, color Doppler ultrasound. A lot of people ask the question, is this an ideal way to go ahead and monitor active surveillance patients? I can know some active surveillance patients that still go see Dubon, but in your experience, is micro ultrasound better, or is this something with which kind of?
So yeah, ideal, I would say, doesn't exist. It's got some very appealing advantages in terms of cost, accessibility, lack of requirement for contrast. The whole issue of contraindications to MRI is really a significant problem. Claustrophobia is remarkably common. Patients who have pacemakers, who have hip replacements, either the signal is degraded by the hip replacement or they can't go into the core with the pacemaker. So it's appealing because of its simplicity, access, relatively low cost. It's not perfect either. You know, it misses cases. The data we have is that about 15% of cases are missed on MRI and seen on ultrasound, and the same in the other direction. So there are cases that you see on MRI that are missed on ultrasound. That's why that is something we don't know too much about at this point. So I just see it as another tool that's very complementary to MRI. And it's particularly appealing to me I'm in Canada, somewhat of an MRI resource constrained environment. It's difficult for us to get the MRIs on all the patients who we think need them in a timely fashion. So this has really been a great benefit. And also there's a lot of parts of the world, the developing world, where they really need a cheaper imaging modality because MRI is simply not available for the majority of the citizens. They just can't afford it. And that's where I think this kind of technology, it looks so promising.
Great, thanks, Laurie. And I think Carissa is back online with us now. And I'm just going to ask you, Carissa, about the role of biomarkers in your practice, and if you've got any comments on that.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Moore. You guys can hear me okay?
Great.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, just bad timing. So yeah, I mean, I think the role of biomarkers is critically important in the counseling of patients on active surveillance. And, you know, I didn't get a chance to completely finish my thought earlier, but it's sort of agreed that, you know, MRI can be a useful tool for patients to either de-intensify or intensify active surveillance, knowing that there is a small proportion of patients that potentially could be missed and maybe caught later on. And, you know, that being said, you know, MRI doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so, you know, something as simple as a PSA density. So, you know, the ratio of a patient's PSA to the volume of their gland is in itself an important prognostic tool. So, you know, we found that at a cutoff of 0.15, which is the ratio of the PSA density, you know, patients can do better or worse on active surveillance. And so that's that's not an expensive test necessarily. It's sort of a quick calculation you can do based on, the size of the gland based on ultrasound or MRI. And 0.15 being kind of a validated cutoff for how we can counsel patients on their likelihood of potentially needing treatment further on. Of course, there are a number of different commercially available FDA approved platforms, which looks a little bit more at the biology, or kind of gets closer to the biology of the tumor, looking at a number of validated either RNA or DNA expression targets. The one I personally have more experience with is with the Decipher product. And if you're on the fence about if you have a favorable intermediate risk lesion, or if the patient has a family history and has certain concerns, that can be an additional tool to say, look, you have one small core of 3+4. Let's look at your Decipher risk score, and that could potentially tip a patient over into deciding whether or not to pursue active surveillance.
Great, thank you. And are there any particular ones that you would use kind of routinely in that situation?
I think the Decipher score is something we have the most experience with. It kind of can prognosticate out to adverse pathology at the time of radical prostatectomy. It can predict the need for adjuvant treatment and has been employed in a couple of prospective trials as well. So that's the product that I'm personally more familiar with, and I know the panel here has used a number of others.
Phil Seagull, I can see that you have a question in the chat, and I was also due to call on you. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Well, I just wanted to hear from Dr. Klotz if he could comment on the difference in terms of biomarker genomic testing in Canada versus USA and possibly Europe as well. Certainly, it seems to me that in the USA, a lot of patients who are on active surveillance, go for the various tests, and I guess perhaps because they have insurance coverage, and perhaps that's not the case in Canada. But I'd like to hear his comments on that.
Yeah, thanks. So just a couple of points. First of all, I just want to emphasize what Carissa said about the value of the simple regular parameter-based nomograms, which include PSA density and a number of other features like family history, age, race, extent of core involvement. These are incredibly predictive, and they're basically free. They're online. Probably the best one right now is from the Canary Pass collaboration, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're part of, Clarissa, but you Google that and you get this risk calculator, and it gives very relatively accurate estimates of the likelihood of higher grade cancer in patients with grade group 1 prostate cancer on repeat biopsy. The second point is for the vast majority of patients in Canada, and certainly for grade group 1 patients, we don't use the tissue-based genetic biomarker tests really at all. And my own belief is they are not really necessary, and they are quite expensive. They cost somewhere around $4,000 US. They're quite labor intensive because the patients with grade group 1 cancer don't benefit from them that much. My belief is that the indication for intervention, aside from the rare patients with things like BRCA mutations, but for the vast majority of patients, the intervention is just upgrading. There really is no other valid reason to treat these patients, and therefore, and we've gotten pretty good at finding those patients with targeted biopsies and so on. So we don't use them. I do think they have a role for the intermediate risk patient who is considering surveillance, because those patients, you have less wiggle room. There's a risk that they may metastasize during surveillance if they've got a more aggressive cancer than you think. So there I agree very much with her comments. The third thing I just want to say on this topic is I see much more promise, frankly, in the liquid biomarkers than the tissue-based biomarkers for a whole slew of reasons. But one is the issue of tumor heterogeneity. So we know there's a lot of genetic heterogeneity between different cancers in the same patient's prostate. And the limitation of the tissue-based biomarkers, they do work. But you biopsy one cancer, you look at the genomics, it gives you some information. That tumor's genomics are often quite different from the one on the other side of the prostate that you don't know about, that you're really interrogating it for. So whereas the liquid-based biopsy, liquid-based assays, pardon me, some of which are just becoming commercially available, don't have that problem. They kind of assess all of the cells that are going on in all the cells that are present in the prostate. And therefore, I think at a kind of conceptual level, they're more appealing in some ways. But the short answer to your question is we have really not embraced that whole field very much in Canada. I think the same is true in Europe.
There. I think, Antonio, you've had your hand up. Sorry for not calling on you earlier. And then I had just a note to define nomogram for the patient audience. So that's where you put in the various test results that you have. I put in one of the online risk calculators into the chat, and it gives you a prediction either of what your risk of upgrading would be at radical prostatectomy or a later outcome.
That's a good point. Very briefly, I just want to go back to MR. So first, I agree with a lot of what Dr. Klotz said. Having something that's cheap and available is obviously important in places where you cannot afford MR. There's not a lot of MR. That said, I do think MR has a lot of benefits. Ultrasound and MR are complementary. We did a study, and he mentioned that too. So we do see things that ultrasound doesn't see, and ultrasound see things that MR will not see. Now, I want to make one very important point. People talk about MR today, and they talk PI-RADS, and PI-RADS and MRI are not synonymous. PI-RADS is a way to look at MR images, but it's not the entire slew of things that we can do with MRI. And it's, there are constant changes in new sequences and new techniques that are being developed and are being tested today in order to try to improve the ability to identify smaller or more aggressive tumors. And that's something that must be kept in mind. This is an evolving field like everything else. It's not only MR, all of these tools are evolving, but it's important to keep that in mind too.
I just want to say I agree 100% with what you say about the MRI that clearly has an ongoing role. I didn't mean to imply otherwise.
No, I know that, but I just want to be clear to I know you know.
All right.
I want to be clear to everyone else.
And we're running a few new sequences as well that are, we hope will be helpful in the future. I'd like to call on Mike Scott next from Philadelphia with if you want to ask your question.
Thank you, Carolyn. One of the issues that is underlying all of this discussion is that we are certainly internationally, but in other ways as well, we don't yet even have consensus on data about the different risk groups. The way you in the UK are collecting those data, it's almost impossible for you to distinguish between very low risk and low risk forms of prostate cancer, as I understand it. But if you're going to start renaming anything, to rename all low risk patients as idle or something else seems to me a little dangerous, because some of those low risk patients are definitely going to be biopsied and found to be not low risk. And I'm interested in the comments of the panel on how we can get consensus on the risk categories and how we can ensure that we are collecting the right data to make sure that we can then monitor these patients in a coherent manner.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm actually going to comment on that myself. I think we are missing some information in almost all of the risk stratification that we do. So even though many of us are using MRI, we don't put it, it's unusual to put in data about the MR lesion, either in terms of volume or whether it's active on one or more sequences. And I think until we incorporate that and potentially other things as well, there's something of an arbitrary distinction between, say, very low risk and low risk. So in our practice, we incorporate those MR features into the risk stratification as well. But it would be good to get some other views on that.
So if I could quickly comment, I mean, I entirely agree with you. And I think one of the opportunities here for these two different research groups is to work together to see if we can define what is really needed, at least at the present time. I mean, we know, for example, that at least one of the new liquid biopsy tests may be helpful in doing this. And we haven't even thought about how we incorporate that data yet. Well, Dr. Klotz probably has, but most of us haven't.
Yeah, great. And I'm really aware that there's a 1 minute left in this panel before we move on to the next. And I would just like to call on Eric Breuers to comment, because we haven't heard from you.
Thank you, because a minute is very little time for a patient to express himself. I would come back also on the MRI and on the high resolution ultrasound, because what we lack is the evidence. Because it's very easily said, we have to do high-res ultrasound instead of the imaging with MRI. Is it MP MRI or what? It took 6 years for the guidelines panel in Europe, I'm a member of that, to introduce MRI, because we needed the evidence that the negative predictive value was safe. Because you don't want, as a clinician, to have a patient with what you call negative MRI, which will end up a year later with an aggressive cancer. So this is something for all these new technologies. We will have to have the patients to let the science and the research do their job, and to come up with enough evidence so that we can trustworthily use that. Because it's the same with liquid biopsies. Liquid biopsies are better if there is more cancer present. Liquid biopsy, the cells go to the blood, but if there's almost no cells in the prostate, there will be almost no cells in the blood. So having liquid biopsies in the active surveillance, for me, is questionable. And I think that a lot of evidence is lacking to be able to say we add this. And that brings me to the financial toxicities. Biomarkers in Europe are very toxic, extremely expensive. So would you put that for all the patients that you monitor? Would you do them these multi-$1,000 costs? I doubt this. And then just try to come back on this MRI and on ultrasound, high resolution. This is done, the high resolution ultrasound is done by the urologist, and I hope they're all trained to do that. I'm not so sure if all radiologists everywhere, all of a sudden doing MRIs and pirates, have the adequate training to do that. But the patient doesn't know if his MRI is read by an expert prostate radiologist. And that makes it somewhat difficult to have the necessary confidence to say, I'm in active surveillance, I'm well monitored, I don't need these biopsies because my MRIs are read by an expert. I think I can leave it with that. There's much more to say, as you know.
Thank you, Eric. And I think that, you make some really good points there, that not only does the evidence need to be generated, which can be generated internationally, but then there needs to be a quality assurance that, for example, if it's MRI, is being done well enough at that hospital if it's going to influence things like omitting the biopsy. I completely agree with you on that, and that it needs to be validated in a surveillance population if that's what we want to use it for, not just for high-grade tumours, which we all know are much easier to see. And I think that takes us really nicely, actually, into our third panel, which I will hand over to Tony Crespino for, looking at the patient research disconnect. So how do we bridge that gap? So Tony, I will hand over to you.
Thank you. And Eric, thank you as well, because your point is well taken. Evidence is what research is about. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists here. We have Dr. Peter Albertsen. He's a pioneer in active surveillance research and is a professor and chief of urology over at the University of Connecticut. We have Dr. Timothy Witt, a professor of medicine and health services researcher at the Minnesota VA healthcare system, and whose work evaluated the comparative effectiveness of harms of observation and watchful waiting. We also have Anthony Henry, first vice president of the Walnut Foundation. I like the term Walnut Foundation. And Joe Gallo, of course, ASPI's own and moderator at on active surveillance over at Answer Cancer and a board member. So initially, as myself, as a known to be working with a lot of experience in research with SWOG and with also setting guidelines with the AUA and ASCO, a lot of question comes on over is what evidence are we missing? Where is the disconnect happening with active surveillance patients? And not only researchers, but active surveillance and a disconnect even with their own physicians. And first things that come on into mind is such as the point is how much evidence do we have to know what is the best MRI test to run? We don't have a great history of clinical trial. And as I also work with the Prostate Cancer Task Force for the National Cancer Institute, I can tell you through SWOG and through that I don't see a lot of active surveillance clinical trials currently going on. I don't see a lot of, most of them are backward studies, and I also don't see a lot of them coming. So this kind of gives us that gap of the disconnect. And my first question for Peter, you've had a history of active surveillance, probably longer than many of us here. What do you think is the biggest disconnect today with what patients want and what physicians are focused on in regards to active surveillance in research?
The bottom line is why have we not done the studies? It usually comes down to money. And quite frankly, the biggest trial that's been successful has been run out of the UK called the PROTECT trial, which has an arm which is called active monitoring. I recently communicated with Freddie Hamdy, the PI, and they're getting ready to publish their 15-year data, which hopefully will be out in the next 6 months. But the problem is to track patients over long periods of time, because we know that a low-grade prostate cancer is a 15 to 20-year disease. It's extraordinarily expensive to track patients consistently and not lose patients to follow-up. That's why I turned to the PROTECT trial. Those PIs have probably done it better than I've seen done anywhere in the world in terms of collecting adequate data. And without complete data, you never know what really happens to patients long-term. And it comes down to these trials. It's all extraordinarily expensive. And the UK up till now has been the only country willing to spend the kind of money it takes to do the trials you need.
Do you think that's due to lack of stakeholders, financial stakeholders? I think that, you know, when we come on into medicines in clinical trial, we get manufacturers, pharma to go ahead and fund them. But clearly, active surveillance stakeholders are many, but it's not a lot of financial support. Do you agree?
You know, I absolutely agree, and it's up to the men who are the patients to lobby NIDDK, because a pharmaceutical company is not going to fund this, a device company is not going to fund this because they see no profit margin in it. So the only one who would fund it in the United States is the NIDDK. They just have to basically get enough of a groundswell to fund this. But we're talking multiple millions of dollars to do a competent study that will be publishable in the New England Journal of Medicine.
So I guess what we're kind of doing is retrospective reflection to come up with the standards today that is provided for the care of an active surveillance patient. And that segues me on over to Tim. Tim, you've done some of the retrospective back to the basics, if you will, looking back at this. Can you tell me what your thoughts are?
So thanks. It's great to be here. It's great to see some faces I haven't seen in a while, even if it's on a Zoom call here. So I agree with Peter that what we need to do are long-term, large randomized controlled trials, and that the PROTECT study is really an outstanding one. But I would say that getting us back to the basics has really, I think, been one of the concerns that we've missed on. As David said early on, Crawford, look at all the things that we can do and look at. And there sure are. And there seems to be, as we talked here, about really not fully bringing forward what we know from the trials that have been completed in observation versus surgery. Any of these new added diagnostic or prognostic tests, as people have said, are very likely to add complications, complexity, and cost with very small incremental gains. They may be statistically significant, but absolute differences are going to be very small. So by the way, organizations that might support it would be, in addition to NIDDK, would probably be the National Cancer Institute or the Department of Veterans Affairs that funded the trial that I ran, which is the PIVOT study. But just let me put it into perspective, and therefore what active surveillance is likely to add incrementally. PIVOT was a randomized controlled trial of observation versus radical prostatectomy, conducting in an early PSA era. About 50% had T1C tumors. Their mean PSA was 10, quite a bit larger and more advanced than what we would see today. After 20 years of follow-up, 9% of individuals died of prostate cancer in low-risk groups, Gleason 6 or smaller, not looking at with MRIs, et cetera. Prostate cancer mortality was about 5%, and absolute differences between surgery and observation, not active surveillance, were about 1%. And that included in risk groups such as capital low risk groups or others, and results didn't vary by age or health status. When you look at life years gained at about 22 years in the low risk group, it was about 1 month. Even in those with intermediate or higher risk disease back in the PIVOT era, absolute differences between surgery and observation, not active surveillance, were only about 5 to 10%. Therefore, and we didn't have treatments that were effective for advanced disease. We have those now. There's some problems with it, but there are some effective treatments. So I really think we need to get back to the basics, what we know from the data from those trials, and do large trials, but they will have to be very large and very long-term because the incremental gains are going to be very small. And what we really want to do is reduce the harms of all the testing and treatment we can do, because there's not, things can't be much less harmful than carefully monitoring folks. And that starts with really realistically the primary care physician as well, because they have a central role in the early diagnosis and evaluation. So thanks. And any concerns I have are incremental with this group here. It's wonderful to be bundled in with them rather than be a pariah. So thank you guys for doing this.
Interesting. And the disconnect as it goes on, I think, leads to a lot of patients not feeling comfortable with their tenure on active surveillance. Upwards of 25% of patients are going to jump off of active surveillance, not because of the facts that they know, but because of the fears that they have. And a great point was brought forward about research in active surveillance on the mental health aspect. And is this a key point of disconnect between physician and patient? Is this a key point of disconnect between researcher and patient? Are we missing an opportunity in going back on over and researching better the psychosocial effects and psychology a patient individually goes through? And I'll open this one up to the entire panel.
Well, I'll stay with it just for a moment. I do think that there needs to be a consensus, or at least a better opportunity for clinicians to bring information and bring evidence. But evidence is only a piece of it. There are so many personal stories and other kind of aspects. And as I think others prior had said, cancer has a really powerful word that goes so far beyond other things that are so much more serious. In primary care, my patients realistically in general are concerned about their heart disease, their diabetes, other things. To be honest, they rarely come into me and ask, can I get a PSA test? If they do, we talk about it and I get it. But I think because there's so much public media pressure, often well-intended, but really distorts, particularly for low risk disease, what it is. And there's been talks about how can we change the name of it. That's going to be a challenge, but this group is part of it. There needs to be really a cultural national shift that really began back with the Nixon era when they declared this war on cancer. You cannot talk about cancer without it being some war against it. And if you don't, you're felt like you're disempowered with that. Whereas for other conditions, I have a hard time getting my patients to take a statin for heart disease or get a COVID vaccine. And those are things I'd far rather have them do.
I just want to pick up on what Tim said. Jenny Donovan did a lot of work in terms of the psychology of how men select treatment in making it the success of the PROTECT trial. Prior to that, randomizing men to an inactive arm was considered impossible. And it all comes down to how you talk to a patient and how you explain the threat posed by their disease. When I have a newly diagnosed patient, that's the very, very first thing I say. What is the threat posed by your disease? And for someone with Gleason grade group 1, I said, you have a 15 to 20-year disease before it's likely to kill you. Most people don't understand those concepts. They assume that they have a glioma or a pancreatic cancer. And I bring up these other cancers that kill you within a year or two and have to bring them down saying, you've got a 15 to 20-year disease. So let's add what your age is. So therefore, the impact of treatment is, if you're already 70, is not going to happen till age 90. When people think in those terms, they begin to, I think, become much more comfortable with the idea of active surveillance. And that's why I've had a lot of success in keeping patients on that for many years. So again, I think that's a very important part, not to say that research isn't needed, but a lot of the research comes down to showing is it's who they're interacting with, their physician, or potentially who is basically instilling the fear that in fact they're likely to progress. And if you constantly stoke the fear, no one's going to continue on active surveillance. And some of the toys that we have, the MRIs, the PSA densities, et cetera, are all the things we can bring to the table to convince someone that they do truly have low risk disease.
So it's kind of consistent to say that educated decisions are better than emotional decisions. And I think that most of us would probably agree with that. And I'd like to hear a little bit from Joe and Anthony from the patient side. Obviously, a key thing that we run into in support groups is people wanting to educate themselves, maybe because they don't feel as educated as they need to be coming out of the physician's office. Maybe your comments on this maybe will help us guide a little bit of discussion as well.
Well, Tony, let me just jump in for here a second. You're talking about from the patient perspective. How does a patient, especially a new or recently diagnosed active surveillance patient, stay current or even stay aware of what's there? You know, in a 15-minute meeting with the doctor, that really doesn't meet the requirements for a newbie. You know, somebody who's been on active surveillance for 15 years, okay, they know where to look, they know how to go about it. And with that, that also becomes an element in scaring some of the guys you were talking about, the 25% who decide to bail out, often because they're like, I don't know, I'm not sure, and I don't know if I can live with this thing anymore.
I would say the trust issue is key here. It's very critical. I think you have to have trust in the people who are advising you. In my case, for example, you know, all we know in my community and my personal experience was surgery. So to be told that you have prostate cancer, and oh, by the way, I'm going to send you off to participate in a 2-year study on active surveillance. It was like, what? Okay, so, you know, it's very important who is providing the advice on there. That's key. One thing I would say to this panel, though, is when you're dealing with the Black community, it's challenging because on the one hand, we want people to have that baseline PSA and, you know, we want them to know their status. But on the other hand, we also have to be careful about overtreatment. So at my group, the Walnut Foundation, what we try to do is to educate, but we also recognize the limitations on that. Because you don't want people to be overtreated, but you also don't want people to not have that PSA, that baseline PSA, and know their status, know where they stand, so they can make the appropriate adjustments as required. So the trust issue, again, is key, and the education is also key. I think the psychological piece is critical, as I kind of indicated in the earlier panel, because you could be there focusing on treatment and not kind of getting to the issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to turn a little bit here into the chat box. Mike Scott, I think that you had a comment that you wanted to raise about patient care.
Thank you, Tony. Yes. One of the things I'd like to remind everybody about is that whatever we are going to do from a research point of view, this is not an academic exercise. This is about improving patient care. And that can include everything from being able to give better prognostic information to people that is more accurate, through to being able to find out whether keeping somebody on active surveillance for 20 years as opposed to taking their prostate out the next morning really makes a difference to their lifestyle, which it does. And I would encourage everybody to really be very focused on this idea that we need a significant improvement in the way in which patients are cared for, mentally, physically, diagnostically, in relation to prostate cancer. Thank you, Tim.
That's a great segue to the next person I'm going to call out here, Dr. Gio Espinosa out of NYU. I've followed your work for quite some time and integrative oncology and how this might apply very well to lifestyle changes and so forth like that. I see you've made a comment on that. Perhaps you'd like to add a comment about maybe how this might help a patient stay on active surveillance and how it might help them improve their life overall for things that might be more abundantly possible to kill them in the first place.
All right. So maybe, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
I'll try to, let's see. All right, I'm here. I'm not in the office, so nice to, thank you, Howard, for inviting me. Briefly, I'll say this. I have so much to say, and I know I probably have less than a minute. I've seen at this point thousands of patients with prostate cancer, and all of whom I've helped them with holistic and lifestyle interventions. And overall, what I would say is that active surveillance is a magnificent diagnosis to help and motivate men to do better with their quality of life and have them evaluate how they live and their value system, what they value in life. Men, for many reasons that we can talk some other time, in general, do not care about health. They care about performance. And they only care about health to the degree that their life is threatened, and then it will threaten their performance, whether it's in the boardroom or in the bedroom. So a diagnosis like Gleason 6 prostate cancer is a perfect opportunity for men to do better. And what I see 80–90% of the times is that men would report, prostate cancer for me is a blessing. Now my cholesterol is lower. I lost weight. Not only have I lost weight, body fat, I lost visceral fat, which is measured. My blood sugar is down. I'm off my meds and this and that and the other. So now you reduce the risk of overall mortality. Biomarkers that I like are typically biomarkers also that are used in other areas in medicine. I think that what I'm trying to look for is and I'll lastly say this, urology. So I work at NYU with great colleagues and prostate cancer oncologists, Tanasia, Lepore, Wysock, great people that we work together. And when my patients go to them, they're asking me, okay, how do you treat prostate cancer with holistic protocols? I said, I don't know that I treat prostate cancer. I'm treating the person and I'm treating the terrain. So part of that terrain are biomarkers that we look at to see how well they're doing. And these are things that are used in other fields in medicine, like C-reactive protein, hemoglobin A1C, and things like that, to see how their terrain is doing. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Tony. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Howard, for inviting me. Great work here, guys. I really appreciate listening to you all.
I'm going to go one more on the chat box, and then I'll go ahead and grab the hands. But I also saw the hand up for Laurence Klotz. Laurie, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted a quick response on this subject of patient compliance. And I believe, as has been alluded to, this is all about communication, effective communication with the patient. And I've developed over the years what to me is just a very efficient and straightforward way to inform the patient. And it's using some key phrases like, this is a pseudo cancer or a pseudo disease. It's part of the aging process. It has zero metastatic potential. You say those three things to a patient, you can see them visibly relax. And for whatever I'm doing right, and I'm sure I'm not doing everything right, but the fall off because of anxiety in my practice, and this is approaching 2,000 patients on surveillance now, is really close to zero since we kind of figured out this strategy. So on the other hand, a clinician who actually doesn't buy it or who doesn't believe in it may give lip service to it because it's kind of the standard of care, but patients are really putty in his hands. So all a clinician has to do is say, yes, you're a candidate for surveillance, but you never really know. There could be something more there, and it could be a threat to you, and boom, the patient is agreeing to treatment. So to my mind, this whole area is really very much a kind of nuanced communication issue. And a piece of that is that the clinician has to believe in it. And if he doesn't, you may end up with a patient much more likely to jump off treatment.
So I want to jump in and really applaud Laurie for that and agree with him 100%. And it goes way beyond prostate cancer. It goes for everything you do in healthcare. First off, if you don't believe it as a clinician, what are you telling it to the patient? You have to be their trusted healthcare advocate, and there needs to be a consistent message. And if they're going and wanting to get it from somewhere else, and that really is tough because you might get input from family members, from the media. Somebody was saying, how do I keep up with the information? There's always going to be a new gizmo that promises to do better if you go my route. So there is that trust. And then again, putting on my primary care hat, we have a million things we have to do if we got 30 minutes. And I think Anthony or somebody else talked about how we have to fix our healthcare system. I really, in my time with the patients, try and ask them, how can I help you out today? What are your concerns? And try and listen to them and bring that in. And sometimes really serve as that kind of liaison between the specialist and the patient, because I can look through the note, I can incorporate that. Now I can learn some of the strategies Laurie has kind of put out there to give to patients. And I think getting that to primary care clinicians is really, really critical. How you can do it efficiently and effectively when there's patient, clinician, and health system demands is a real challenge.
Right.
Thank you very much, both. I would be remiss if I didn't call on Mark Lippy. He's got his hand up. He's kind of the captain of the show.
Hey, thank you, Tony. This is a great session. And to Joe Gallo's comment about how overwhelming this issue can be for a newly diagnosed patient, it's absolutely true. And it goes to the message of ASPI and Answer Cancer, Rick's group. We are trying to promote empowered patients. And guess what? All of the doctors on this call, I assure you, welcome empowered patients, patients that do their homework. As long as we as patients don't approach them with a chip on our shoulders, with a chip on our shoulders, indicating that we know more than they do, they're going to accept what we say. And this, I'm sure every doctor on this call is that way, very inviting. They want to hear from us. I'm sure there's some doctors out there that don't, but it's all in the way we approach it, all in the way we communicate. And if we communicate with humility, they will receive us and they will listen to us. And by the way, there's one other quick thing I wanted to say about Dr. Bangma. And Ola, it's good to see you on this call. I can't tell you, you said when you spoke that when you were at our webinar, when you are conveying the information of prostate cancer diagnosis to a low-risk patient, you say you have no cancer that needs to be treated. You have no cancer that needs to be treated. Now, can you imagine the difference in hearing those words than you have cancer? And Ola, I've told that to a dozen people. It's just such a wonderful way to convey that news. Thanks again, Tony.
I know that we're pressed for time here, and in the spirit of the time that we have, I'm going to ask just one more question or ask one more person to respond, and then I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Mike Scott. But Govinda, I think that you have your hands up the longest, and I would like to hand you the microphone for a few.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add to the compassionate care aspect of the whole thing. I am a prostate cancer survivor, and when I was diagnosed in Toronto, after the doctor and the nurse practitioner talked to me, I was told that there is a peer navigator who can talk to me about the different aspects of treatment and active surveillance, which was a great help to me at that point of time. Because the time a doctor or a medical practitioner can give you is limited, but the support from a support group, which is consisting of people who have gone through the whole process, is invaluable in the psychological aspect of the whole prostate cancer journey. And the help you get from them is not limited to their experience, but they will tell you what questions to ask to the doctors when you meet them next time, and what are the resources available to select your treatment. All this is invaluable, because I feel that support group or peer navigation group is extremely important in this way.
What's going on down the road, it's better to ask the people that are coming back. And I think that the peer support groups have been invaluable in helping promote active surveillance. I think that that's going to continue to be the case. And it goes back on to what I think I've heard repeated here multiple times. Educated decisions are better than emotional decisions. Howard, last one. You got your hand up?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I actually want to bring up a question that Rick Davis mentioned. And I'd like to, well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who came. I think this has been a really worthwhile effort, and it fulfills something that the ASPI group and Mike Scott envisioned 5 years ago. So what better time than now, if not 5 years ago? But my question for the doctors is what Rick asks: is Gleason 6 ever lethal? And so, I'm going to put Dr. Klotz and Dr. Wilt.
Yes, but rarely.
But when did some of the doctors weigh in?
So I would say yes, but rarely, and probably even more rare now than it was back when we did pivot.
So the way I formulate that is, does Gleason 6 have the ability to metastasize? And I have been collecting these cases. So the problem is with Gleason 6 on biopsy, you have the confounder of the higher grade cancer that's present that you don't know about. So you can only judge this from the experience with Gleason 6 treated with radical prostatectomy, where the whole prostate has been evaluated and there's no higher grade cancer. And I can tell you, because I've asked many audiences this over a long time, the number of cases in the world where a patient's had a radical prostatectomy for only Gleason 3 pattern in the whole prostate and gone on to recur and had a metastatic cancer. I know of about 4 cases. And that is probably represents millions of patients. And I think probably those 4 were misgraded. So in my view, it is a correct statement to say, and in medicine, we're taught never say never, but Gleason 6 never metastasizes.
But Laurie, with the watchful waiting and pivot, we had 6s that obviously had some higher Gleasons in the gland because that was the observation arm.
Right. No, but that's the thing. So you can't, of course, Gleason 6 on biopsy, those patients can metastasize but it's the higher grade cancer that's metastasized. So you have to make that distinction. So what I tell patients is, yes, you could have something worse, but what you know about is never, ever going to cause you a problem.
Chris Bangma, how about you? Gleason 6, does it ever kill?
I think I totally agree with what Laurie is saying. Gleason 6 doesn't kill, it doesn't metastasize. But the point is that we are just missampling once in a while the prostate. So there's always this missampling error that confuses us and brings about this everlasting threat of something could happen. And the longer we stay away from it, the longer we see that it doesn't happen and that this 6 really is a 6 and the people can stay away from invasive surgery.
If I can just add to Chris's point, which I agree with, but keep in mind, biology is dynamic and things change over time. So, and there was a question on the chat that I responded to, Gleason 6 can turn into higher grade cancer. And the best estimate is that happens around somewhere between 1% and 2% of cases per year. And it's usually in patients who have high volume Gleason 6. So you could have a Gleason 6 and it could kill you because in 5 or 10 years, it's now a Gleason 7 and that has a metastatic potential. But that is rare, and that is, it's not the disease you have today, it's the disease you're developing in 5 or 10 years that's responsible for it.
Yeah, I want to emphasize Laurie's point about it's rare. I mean, again, in pivot, people obviously had 7s or 8s or 9s and or quote unquote, they progressed. But when they were 6s at baseline with all the things that are being talked about, their 20-year risk of prostate cancer death was well less than 5%. Differences with surgery were less than 1%, and life expectancy gained was 1 month. And it's far better today that with just watchful waiting. Forget active surveillance. Just watchful waiting is far better today because of lead and length bias, and because they're not great, but we've got successful therapies if and when it should spread. We didn't have that back in pivot in the 90s. That's something to applaud, albeit we don't want to have to use it.
But this is just why we do active surveillance. There's no issue now, but we will carefully monitor your disease. If it ever progresses, we are there for you.
Yeah.
We don't try to evade that, but that's the fact. Otherwise, you have a Gleason 6, go home, never come back.
We've actually just published a study. We compared survival in patients who complied with the follow-up protocol versus those who didn't, and it actually made a difference. on surveillance. There was higher prostate cancer mortality in the ones who had not come back for the follow-up biopsies and so on. So just agreeing with all the points that are being made about the importance of follow-up.
And I'm sorry to have detoured things, but it's something I thought we should discuss. Tony,
if
I'm
I
just,
may,
yeah.
Keeping true to a moderator who's let things go over time, I'll say, Howard, what you probably need to do is consider some more discussions on if it's cancer, if it's not cancer. Bring a panel out like this in there, because the input from everybody in this group was fantastic. I know that there's a lot of people who are putting things into the chat box. I didn't get to them, but keeping into the spirit of the time, I have to conclude this panel. And I'm going to go ahead and hand this one on over to Mike Scott for our closing comments.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. So first of all, I would like to congratulate ASPI-AnCan and all the supporting organizations for putting this meeting together. Second, I would like to thank all of the speakers and panelists for giving their time and their assistance to the program. It has been nearly 40 years since the late Jerry Chodak got himself in terrible trouble by starting to suggest that we might be over-treating prostate cancer. We have come a very long way since then. And a lot of that has been due to some people on the panels today, Dr. Witt, Dr. Klotz, Dr. Albertson, and others. The way we need to move forward, however, is critically important, because we need to try to work as much as we can together with very well-defined and shared goals. I would hate to think, for example, that Movember and Dr. Siddiqui's group were to do two trials which were separate but not quite identical. It would be much better if they worked together to do one trial which was mutually acceptable to all of them. And finally, the last thing I would like to say to everybody today is Dr. Witt brought up the question of patient influence on the ability to raise money for prostate cancer research. It is critical that the active surveillance community works together to start to really put pressure on the NCI, on NIDDK, on the Department of Defense funding organization, in order to raise money that is focused on active surveillance and lower risk patients, so that we can resolve some of these questions that are so important to the care of patients. And with that, I will again just thank everybody for being here today, and I look forward to having more conversations like this over the next few years, and maybe several times a year. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
And thank you all for attending.